Hello, friends. Welcome to this week's episode of Currently Workshopping, a show where we work through the peril and frisons of being alive together. I'm your host, Cece, and as you can tell, I am filming from the wonderful city of Las Vegas right now rather than New York, although I did start this episode in New York, so bear with me as there's kind of like some back and forth. This will be essentially a multi-time zone production. This week, in honor of the Supreme Court's docket, I'll be tackling the thorny issue of growing up Asian American in affirmative action America. In this episode, I discuss my own brushes with affirmative action, give an overview of the history of affirmative action in the US, and delve into why this is such a hot button topic with a lot of strong opinions on all sides. Before we get started, a huge shout out to ACM Marquez for leaving a review. I really appreciate it as it does help me out a lot. And now let's dive in. On Halloween of all days, the Supreme Court held oral arguments in two affirmative action cases, one against Harvard and one against the University of North Carolina, UNC. The plaintiff in both cases is a conservative group called Students for Fair Admissions, SFFA or SFA, headed up by Edward Bloom. Remember his name, as this isn't his first foray into challenging affirmative action. Bloom contends that applicants to colleges today are treated differently because of their race and ethnicity. Some are given a thumbs up and some are given a thumbs down. His words, not mine. So the schools here, Harvard and UNC, take the position that in addition to academic achievements, they aim for a demographically diverse student body, which involves evaluating factors such as home state, national origin, family background, special achievements, and yes, race. All in all, this is a really thorny issue that gets a lot of people heated up, I think, because it implicates identity in our era of identity politics and identity marketing. Throw in the fact that the college dream, or maybe scam, which I spoke about a few weeks ago, is alive and well, and this issue of affirmative action feels like life or death. Like when I was in high school, it did feel like if I didn't get into college, if I didn't get into particular colleges, my life would be over. Like, did it make sense? No, of course not. But it was absolutely how I felt, and absolutely is still how some high schoolers and their parents feel. I genuinely believed that college was going to make or break my life. If I didn't get into a quote-unquote good college, I thought that the only alternative was working retail or becoming a housewife. I have no idea where this conception came from because there are obviously many jobs in the world you can do besides retail or domestic work, but my parents also never really helped disabuse me of this notion. I think they too saw college as a necessary step to advancing in America, of achieving this American dream that they moved halfway across the world for. And who can blame them? In China, even high school admissions is make or break, and that's not even getting into everything that's on the table for Gaokao, which is the standardized college admissions exam. I sometimes get pretty rude comments about my parents asking like why they put so much pressure on me, saying that they were abusive, and it's honestly hard for me to read those comments because they're not really the point here, you know? They didn't put their lives online for everyone to comment on, and while yes, I do share my experiences and my experiences with them, because I think sharing about those experiences growing up with demanding parents helps others feel less alone about this like weird shame and pride that's associated with that kind of upbringing. But like how they were to me is kind of between me and them at the end of the day. I've realized that they weren't perfect. They've realized that they weren't perfect, and they totally know that I'm not perfect. And while I would have totally put them on blast online when I was a teenager, had I had any platform available to me, I've come to understand a lot more the very valid fears and motivations that underpin their actions, even if they weren't the best actions. In fact, I think being at odds with my parents so much over the years has helped me be a bit more compassionate and sympathetic towards others with different viewpoints. Not saying that I agree with those views in any way, because my parents and I still butt heads a lot, but I've come to appreciate more how the intersectionality of our various experiences means that while we might look similar and all that, there are still many divergences in experiences between my parents and myself. For example, a few years ago, I went home to California only to find my parents actively campaigning and fundraising for a state representative. Historically, while they did vote, they were never like the most politically engaged people. They didn't phone bank, volunteer for campaigns, none of that. So the fact that they were now furiously organizing fundraisers and inviting all of their Chinese friends in the Bay Area to attend and donate made me really confused. And guess what? They were fundraising for a candidate who had promised to vote against affirmative action in the California Constitution. This was the single issue that had gotten them so involved and active. This probably isn't surprising for you if you also had Asian parents who were pretty stereotypically tiger parents, and I think California in particular has a pretty interesting history with affirmative action. In 1996, California voters passed a constitutional amendment to California's constitution, essentially stating that the state shall not discriminate or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin when it comes to public employment, public education, or public contracting. The amendment essentially prohibits, constitutionally, any affirmative action policies by California public schools. I think for any of those familiar with how the UC, the University of California system looks, there's jokes sometimes. Like, I remember when I was applying for college, UCLA, the University of California at Los Angeles, was jokingly, maybe not jokingly, called the University of Caucasians, Lost in Asians. And I think sometimes this demographic that we do see in a lot of the public California colleges is what tends to occur if admissions places a lot of weight on things like testing and standardized tests, because I mean, my parents are amazing at preparing for standardized tests and also amazing at preparing me for standardized tests. And I think they're not alone in that, partially due to the fact that they themselves went through such a rigorous standardized testing system in order to come to America. Anyway, in 2020, in the wake of our society's much larger discussion about race, a proposition was put onto the ballot to overturn this previous constitutional amendment, essentially making it permissible for affirmative action policies to be instituted. The 2020 proposition, though, didn't succeed, despite a ton of endorsements by the likes of then Senator Kamala Harris and Senator Dianne Feinstein, and really, really successful fundraising. California's grappling, though, with affirmative action isn't just limited to the state. California plays a key part in our federal affirmative action discussion as well. The first Supreme Court case about affirmative action was in 1978, Regents of the University of California v. Bakke. Back then, UC Davis's medical school reserved 16 out of every 100 admissions spots for qualified minority students. Bakke, a white man, was denied admission by UC Davis and sued on the basis that his test scores were higher than admitted minority students. The Supreme Court sided with Bakke, holding that the quota system, this setting aside of 16 specific spots for minorities, was unconstitutional, but also ruling that schools more generally have a compelling interest in admitting a diverse student body, so admissions committees could consider race in admissions, just not as the only factor. So after Bakke in 1978, schools revised their admissions policies to reflect this case, race-conscious admissions, but not quotas. In 2003, these types of race-conscious admissions policies were challenged in the Supreme Court again in two cases, Gratz v. Bollinger and Grutter v. Bollinger, where white people who got rejected from the University of Michigan sued. Gratz and Grutter were interesting because they clarified the bounds of affirmative action policies in the U.S. One was upheld and one was overturned, and are still kind of what schools go off of today when it comes to crafting a race-conscious admissions policy. In Gratz, the plaintiffs challenged a system where Michigan granted admission to any applicant who scored more than 100 points out of a 150-point scale. Underrepresented minority applicants were granted 20 points. The court found that this type of point system was unconstitutional because race wasn't considered as a factor in admissions. It just straight up was a 20-point bonus and raised the floor for admissions for minority students. Grutter, on the other hand, affirmed the premise in 1978's Bakke, finding that admissions officers could still consider the race of applicants. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor penned the majority opinion back then, and proponents of affirmative action today like to point to the fact that she wrote in that opinion that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary to further the interest approved today. It's funny because about 7 years later, O'Connor co-wrote an essay about affirmative action, stating that her opinion in Grutter shouldn't be seen as imposing a 25-year deadline on affirmative action, and that social scientists and empirical evidence would be needed to figure out when exactly affirmative action can be sunset. So this really goes to show you the importance of words and how things that you write and say years ago really follow you and even take on a life of their own. I sometimes wonder if O'Connor is watching the current proceedings and regretting that she had arbitrarily written in 25 years in her opinion back then. Fast forward a few more years, and a white woman sued the University of Texas over its admissions policy. This is Fisher v. University of Texas in 2016, and this case was bankrolled by, surprise, surprise, Edward Bloom. So the current Harvard and UNC case being considered by the Supreme Court isn't Bloom's first time funding a case all the way to the top, and he seems really hell-bent on dismantling affirmative action. Fisher's challenge to UT's admissions policy failed, though, so it was more of a blip in the overall landscape of affirmative action. Grutter still was the controlling modern precedent, but I think many of us, myself included, didn't realize that Fisher was part of a larger agenda that was very well bankrolled and therefore was not likely to go away. Like, I remember writing about Gratz, Grutter, and the first time in 2013 when Fisher was heard at the Supreme Court back in college in a class called, naturally, Discrimination in Law. And that means that I actually have to finish packing and go to the airport so I can fly to NAPABA, which is the National Asian and Pacific American Bar Association conference. It's in Vegas, so I will pick this back up in Vegas and see you then in my hotel room. All right, guys, now I am broadcasting from Vegas. As you can see, this is my hotel room, and it's actually colder in Vegas right now than it is in New York, and it's going to be colder in Vegas than in New York all week. So it's a really lovely time to actually have flown to Vegas to have a very, very cold few days. Okay, so we were just talking about how I had taken a class in college called Discrimination in Law, and at the time I was a staunch libertarian. I know. It's one of those things where I think every few months some people find out or re-find out that I used to be really, really conservative throughout all of college and most of law school. And I mean like pretty conservative, like almost like problematically conservative, where I really didn't care about other people. And I think this is one of my core changes over the past, 10, 12 years, is that when I was in college, I really didn't care about other people in a way. And there's a whole backstory to why that is, which I'll talk a lot more about on this week's Patreon. So head over there if you kind of want the whole backstory there of how I came to have joined really the Federalist Society. But even though I would have identified as a Republican over a Democrat back then, I still wrote in my paper that I thought that there was a space for affirmative action in American society that, based upon my research, race-conscious admissions was still appropriate. My view that it was still appropriate was really based upon my own experiences in college. From K to 12, right? The school that you go to if you go to public school is based upon where your parents live. And where your parents live is largely based upon socioeconomic status. And socioeconomic status has really disproportionate representations when it comes to race. Because of that, I'm ashamed to admit that I never really thought that hard about whether I was exposed to diverse people growing up. My school was predominantly white and Asian, which meant that I didn't have this experience really in high school of feeling like I was in a minority group. Like, yes, I knew that I wasn't white, but there were also a lot of us. And having that privilege also meant that I didn't interact that much with our Black and Hispanic students. And now looking back at the time, I'm just flabbergasted by how narrow my world was, right? And how little I cared about others' experiences and how little I sought out knowledge about other people's experiences. I know nowadays it's like, why don't you Google it? Why don't you research it? Someone out there has probably written something about it. But back then, the internet was kind of seen as this dark hole of misinformation, and you shouldn't rely on it too much, which is kind of funny because I would actually argue that nowadays the internet is even more of a dark hole of misinformation, but that's neither here nor there. And I was just like dumb. Like, I was just a dumb kid. I did really well in school, sure, but I was just this really, really dumb kid who wanted to succeed at any cost. If you had told me to shave off my eyebrows and pluck out all of my eyelashes in order to be respected and seen as successful in society, I would have done it because I was just like that dumb. The other way that I was dumb was that I just assumed that my experience of the world was just everyone else's experience, the definition of essentialism, right? Even in college, a lot of my friends were from similar socioeconomic backgrounds as me, right? Middle class or upper middle class, and we tended to hang out with each other. And I also noticed that the uber wealthy kids, like the ones with celebrity parents or just had like tons of intergenerational wealth that was very obvious, they tended to hang around each other. Now, this might seem like a point against affirmative action because what's the point of affirmative action if people just hang out with like people like themselves too? But bear with me. Senior year, there's this tradition of joining a senior society, kind of like a secret society, like I think the famous one is Skull and Bones, right? But less secretive, and there's actually more societies senior year than just Skull and Bones. And a lot of societies do this tradition called bios. Each member of the society gets a night to do their bio, which is essentially a presentation of their entire life and what got them to that point in time. It's a really cool way to look back upon your whole existence and kind of pick out the significant moments in your life that made you who you are and kind of like shaped your beliefs. It sounds super solipsistic and a lot of navel gazing, I know, and it was, but that wasn't the beauty of it. The beauty of it wasn't necessarily doing your own, although I think that was a helpful exercise for kids at 22, right? Trying to think about what to do with their lives. But the beauty of the exercise was in listening to other people's bios. My society in particular had an emphasis on composing a group of people who didn't already know each other, and I absolutely love that. Like, I knew some of the people and I vaguely was familiar with them, but I didn't know anyone that well, and I also had some like preconceptions about the people whom I did know. And this exercise where we really presented all of the moments and experiences in our lives that made us who we are was really eye-opening. Sometimes people's hopes and fears didn't line up at all with what I imagined for them, and other times they faced difficulties and hardships that I couldn't even imagine because they seemed so well adjusted and also so comfortable with the really rich kids, which at the time I was very uncomfortable with. So they just felt like they were in a different league, you know? And weirdly enough, I think this was the first time in my life where I had really gone really deep and really all in with people that otherwise were strangers to me and whom I otherwise really didn't know. And it was honestly an incredible experience. Like, I cannot overstate the pleasure of being surprised by people, especially at a time when I think sometimes you get a lot more jaded and wonder, oh, is this just like adulthood? Is this just growing up? And it's instead of life being this like series of possibilities and like fun, life becomes the series of ever more narrow and demanding tasks of you, right? And I think one of the greatest joys in life as one gets older is still being able to be surprised by life. And this was definitely one of those moments. So I think this meshing of the minds, or whatever did happen there, is the educational benefit of diversity that Justice Clarence Thomas is so skeptical about. Did it make us all hold hands together and sing Kumbaya? No. We disagreed on many points later, and honestly, I think I was really insensitive in many ways to a lot of their experiences still afterwards, even after bios and even after that year. But it started something. It primed me to be a little bit more open-minded about other people's experiences and more accepting of the fact that I did not and could not know people. And that, I think, is a really valuable posture to have going into your post-college life, where for the first time you're leaving the structures and the very obvious plan of an academic institution and going out into the greater world. And this is the time in my life where I just wanted safety at all costs. Like, I didn't know who I was outside of school. I didn't know what to do outside of school. And I just like wanted safety. And I think safety in general, wanting that as your core purpose in life, leads you to be a bit more narrow-minded and close-minded about things because you want the assurance almost of a plan. You want the assurance of that ladder. You want the assurance of that conveyor belt. That feeling of danger and uncertainty all around, it's really easy to conceive of the world as zero-sum when you're feeling that. Like every win for someone else is a loss for you, that there are limited spots open for life success. That zero-sum mindset, I think, is what undergirds some of the opponents of affirmative action. Like, I know for my parents, they felt really threatened by affirmative action. I know that my parents felt that race-conscious admissions in California meant that there would be fewer Asian Americans admitted to schools like UC Berkeley, UCLA. It directly contravenes the rules and systems which they had grown up in, right? Where your performance on this one test, the Gaokao, pretty much was determinative of your future. And they saw this test as the great equalizer, which I think in China, it was a lot more so than in the US, where educational opportunities and attitudes towards education are just so disparate. On the one hand, I appreciate this fear and feeling of unfairness, that Asian Americans shouldn't be penalized for having on average higher test scores, that race-conscious admissions is a way to discriminate against Asian Americans using the stereotype that they're less personable, they're worse communicators, that they're a shy, bookish Asian girl or boy, when they may, in fact, not be shy or bookish, and even if they were shy and bookish, what is so bad about that? So I understand where they're coming from, right? Like they hear affirmative action and they envision everything in their life that was based upon exams, and they see their own opportunities and what if they hadn't gotten them, and then they see opportunities based on exams for their own kids, and what if their kids don't have them, what if their friends' kids don't have them, what if other Asian Americans don't have them. And I think it's really scary for them, this future where even studying isn't necessarily a guarantee onto a seat of the social mobility vehicle of higher education. And if that were the only interest at stake, then sure, affirmative action would be questionable, but it's clearly not the only interest at stake. Bloom has done a great job of weaponizing Asian American fears around the disappearance of higher education as a tool for social mobility by actively fostering the disappearance of higher education as a tool for social mobility for other, way more disadvantaged groups. Like, honestly, that would be genius if it weren't so heinous. And sometimes I wonder even what the goal of dismantling affirmative action is, right? The freshman class at Harvard right now self-identified as 27.9% Asian American, when in the 2020 census, approximately 7.2% of respondents identified as Asian. Now, I'm not saying that 27.9% should be like the cap on Asian Americans at Harvard, because I don't think admissions should be thought of as that, but I do kind of wonder, Asian Americans seem already pretty well represented at Harvard, particularly in proportion to US demographics. And if 27.9% Harvard representation for 7.2% national composition isn't good enough, then I have the same question that I asked my parents all throughout middle and high school. What then is good enough? Okay, I kind of need to wrap up here and get ready and just, actually go to the conference that I flew all this way for. But I do want to point out that there are two larger questions kind of overarching our whole discussion. First, if we eliminated race as a factor in admissions, would we still be able to compose a diverse student body looking at factors such as socioeconomic status? This is a policy that the lawyers for SFA have really put forward as a way to substitute for affirmative action. Its workability as a substitute will largely depend on whether these other factors, race, socioeconomic status, are good proxies for what we're actually trying to select for, right? Which is diverse life perspectives and life experiences. Admissions committees are trying to identify diverse life experiences and diverse life perspectives, and just how well socioeconomic status is in lieu of race as a proxy for identifying this is, I don't know, I feel like some social scientists would have to tell me. But proxies in general are something that I'm really interested in, right? Because I think, especially in law, we use so many proxies to try and figure out things, especially in like law firm recruiting. There's use of a lot of proxies, right? Like where'd you go to school, grades, as a way to identify what we're trying to actually find for, which is, will you be a good lawyer? And not even just that, but like, will you be a good law firm associate, which is a different type of lawyer than would you be a good solo practitioner? Because some of the skills that make you a good law firm associate may not necessarily make you a good solo practitioner. I'll probably do a whole episode on proxies in the future, so stay tuned for that. And the second question that this all raises is what happens to these high schoolers, these college students, when their application gets rejected by an institution, and then they see their parents, society at large, spending years and years fighting, protesting this result, right? Like, I am all for higher education. Learning to think, to speak, to write is one of the greatest skills you can learn in life, but these lawsuits put these particular institutions and enrollment in these particular institutions on a pedestal. Instead of accepting that your odds were ever not in your favor when your application gets rejected from Harvard, because to be honest, even if you have perfect scores, even if you are a fantastic candidate, the odds are just not in our favor for admission to an institution like Harvard. But instead of just accepting that and looking forward to your future education at, say, UC Santa Barbara or something, you see your parents and everyone else wage years-long civil litigation over this fact that you didn't get into Harvard. Like, is that not silly? Would that not also make you feel like the difference between Harvard and UCSB is like life or death, such that these people would pour tons tons of money and years into waging this battle for you. The fact of the matter is that certain schools will have certain advantages over other schools, but it also doesn't matter in the long run if you don't let it. But that's a mindset that a lot of parents don't allow their kids to have, don't encourage their kids to have, and that can really wreak havoc on the mental health of their children. And I know the expected retort here is, well, Cece, it's easy for you to say because the odds were ever in your favor. What if you hadn't been one of the lucky ones and had gotten rejected from Yale? And that's a good point. Like, if that had happened to me, I most certainly would have been really depressed. I did get deferred from early action at Yale, and I spent the rest of the day basically in bed under the covers because I was so depressed from that. And I also know that I probably would have spent the next 12 years of my life at least agonizing over the fact that I didn't get in, because that was who I was. I was always like a very backwards looking child, very obsessed with the counterfactual, what would have happened, alternate universes, and this idea that I maybe missed out on the chance of my life because that's how my parents presented college to me, right? It was like, it was the chance of a lifetime, and it was like going to decide whether I succeeded in life or not, or failed. But I would also hope that in due time, alternate universe CC would be able to come to terms with the fact that your college doesn't like define you. Your college doesn't make or break you. The fact that you go to a college doesn't mean that you'll be set for the rest of your life, doesn't mean that you'll be successful ever after, right? And on the other hand, going to a college that you didn't necessarily like dream of doesn't mean that you're going to be stuck doing a job that you hate forever for like little pay. So yeah, I would really hope that alternate universe CC finds peace sooner or later with her non-Ivy League life, because I know tons of people who did not go to Ivy League institutions who are more successful and, more importantly, happier than I am, who haven't gotten a drop of whatever magical elixir that I thought would be handed out at these Ivy League institutions. And these people, these successful, happy people, didn't get to where they are by obsessing constantly over a life that they weren't living. Okay, wow, I said I would go and then I didn't, but now I really must go and actually like do some conference things. But thank you a million for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode and got something new out of this hot button issue that I'm sure you might be sick of hearing about. I've linked all references in the show notes below, as well as my website, where you can find all my socials and other projects, including my Patreon, where I upload weekly bonus postscripts. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd really appreciate if you rate, reviewed, and subscribed, and I will do a shout out on next week's episode where I will be back in New York. See you then.